Have you ever wondered why a man suddenly turns cold the moment you get close enough to touch the walls he swore he didn't have? Why his warmth disappears right after he looks at you like you're the only person who ever saw him clearly? It feels personal, doesn't it? As if his silence were a verdict, his distance a rejection. But beneath that mask of indifference, something deeper trembles. A war between the man he shows and the boy he still hides. When a man grows cold, he is rarely detached. He is, instead, flooded, overwhelmed by feelings he doesn't yet have the structure to contain. The ancient Stoics called it pathos, the storm of emotion that enslaves those who never learn to master their own hearts. But this mastery is not absence of feeling. It's the ability to face it without being consumed. Most men, however, were never taught how. They were taught to endure, to suppress, to be functional even when they were fractured. Carl Jung once wrote that the masculine soul carries both the hero and the wounded child. The hero pushes forward, the child hides behind the armor. When he feels safe with you, the armor loosens. And that's precisely when his fear awakens. He begins to sense that you can see beyond his persona, the carefully constructed self that he believes the world will accept. You see his anima, the soft, unlived, emotional self buried beneath duty, ambition, and control. And to be seen like that, to be emotionally naked, terrifies him more than being unloved ever could. He acts cold not because he feels nothing, but because he feels too much. His distance is an act of survival. A man's unconscious does not speak in words. It speaks in withdrawal, silence, or sudden harshness. These are the symptoms of an internal fracture he cannot yet name. Deep down, he fears that if he lets love in, it will expose the chaos within him. The boy who was never comforted, the son who learned to equate affection with weakness, the lover who associates vulnerability with loss. This coldness is not the absence of care, it's the manifestation of defense. His ego, Jung would say, is at war with the unconscious, the unhealed shadow that whispers he is not enough, and every time you reach closer, that shadow screams louder, convincing him that detachment will save him from being seen as broken. So he distances himself not from you, but from the parts of himself that awaken in your presence. You see, men often crave love on a level that terrifies them. They want to be understood, to rest, to be accepted, but they have built their worth around performance and control. To let go of that is to risk the collapse of the identity they've spent their lives maintaining. The colder he becomes, the more he's trying to protect that fragile construct from disintegration. He is not pushing you away as much as he is trying to keep his carefully ordered world from falling apart. If you observe closely, the coldness isn't steady. It flickers. One day, he's distant. The next, he's tender again, like someone drowning and surfacing for breath. That's the dance of the masculine wound, the oscillation between longing and fear, between the desire to merge and the terror of disappearing. Jung called this the battle of opposites, the tension between the conscious and unconscious, the masculine and feminine energies within the psyche. He acts cold not because he's heartless, but because he's trapped in that tension, unable to reconcile both halves. And yet, when you respond with silence, when you meet his withdrawal with grounded self-possession rather than pleading, something powerful happens. You mirror to him what he's lost. Equilibrium. Your calm becomes the antidote to his chaos. The more you center yourself, the more his unconscious begins to sense safety. It is not your pursuit that heals him, but your stillness, because love that chases affirms his fear of being consumed, while love that stands firm teaches him that closeness does not equal captivity. A man's coldness is never just about you. It's a reflection of his inner exile, the parts of himself he has banished in the name of strength. He hides tenderness behind sarcasm, affection behind logic, pain behind stoicism. But behind every wall he builds lies the same desire, to be loved without needing to perform, to be accepted without needing to pretend. So, the next time his warmth fades into distance, remember this: it is not always rejection. Sometimes it is reverence in disguise. Sometimes he steps back because, for a brief moment, your presence made him feel alive again. And that scared him, because to feel again means he can lose again. But love, the real kind, does not beg or bargain. It simply holds space and waits for the truth to rise from beneath the ice. When a man withdraws into silence, it is not the silence of indifference. It is the silence of a soul trying to translate emotion into language. Yet men are rarely fluent in the dialect of their own hearts. They were taught to solve, not to feel. They learned to build walls faster than they learned to articulate pain. So when something within him begins to stir, tenderness, grief, attachment, his instinct is to retreat into solitude, to regain control of a world that suddenly feels unsteady. This retreat, to the woman who loves him, feels cruel. It feels like erasure, as if every shared glance, every conversation that felt alive was an illusion. But Jung would remind us that the psyche always seeks balance. The masculine, when flooded by the feminine, whether through emotion, love, or spiritual connection, must pull back to re-establish its boundaries. This is not always rejection. It is a primitive reflex, an unconscious recalibration. The same warmth that melts his armor can also threaten the fragile scaffolding of his identity. Most men live their lives haunted by an invisible contradiction. They yearn to be seen, yet fear exposure. They crave connection, yet equate dependence with weakness. This duality is the tragedy of the modern man, taught to suppress his inner world until it becomes a pressure chamber. So when love appears, genuine and deep, it doesn't soothe him, it detonates him. Every suppressed emotion begins to surface. The ghosts of his childhood emerge. The father he tried to impress, the mother he tried to protect, the failures he never forgave himself for, all awaken at once, whispering that he is not ready to be loved like this. And so, he acts cold, because detachment is easier than confession, because distance feels safer than transparency. He wears indifference like armor, not realizing that it cuts him off from the very intimacy he longs for. He becomes the architect of his own loneliness, building a fortress so strong that even warmth feels like an invasion. Yet beneath the stoic expression, there is always movement. The trembling of something still alive, the eyes that avoid contact, the voice that grows quieter, the breath that quickens when you step closer. These are betrayals of the truth. His body remembers what his mind refuses to accept, that he is not indifferent, only afraid, that your presence awakens a softness he's buried for years, and that to feel again is to risk being shattered again. Jung would call this the encounter with the anima, when the masculine psyche meets its inner feminine, often projected onto a woman. It is a sacred confrontation. Through you, he glimpses his own depth. He begins to sense that the emotions he's denied are not weakness, but gateways to wholeness. And that realization terrifies him, because it demands death. The death of the mask, the false invulnerability, the pride that has protected him for decades. He withdraws not only to avoid you, but to avoid transformation. Every man who loves deeply is forced to face the death of his old self. The question is whether he has the courage to stay in that fire long enough to be reborn. Some run, some freeze, some lash out, convincing themselves that the woman who saw them too clearly must be the threat. In truth, she was the mirror. You, the woman on the receiving end of his coldness, must understand this. You cannot thaw his silence with persuasion. You cannot argue warmth into existence. The more you chase his attention, the more his fear of engulfment will rise. The feminine force that heals is not pursuit, it is presence. When you stand in your own light, Untethered from the need for validation, you become what Jung called the individuated woman, whole unto herself. And paradoxically, that wholeness invites the masculine back to life. There is a subtle alchemy at play here. When you stop reaching for his warmth, he begins to confront his own absence. The silence he used to control you begins to echo inside him instead. And in that echo, he starts to feel the void he's been avoiding. The emptiness that no career, no achievement, no escape can fill. He begins to understand that love was never the threat. It was the cure he was too afraid to take. Still, you must resist the urge to become his therapist, his redeemer, his mother. That path leads only to depletion. You are not responsible for pulling him out of his emotional exile. True transformation must be self-chosen. What you can do is stand in truth, to love without losing yourself, to understand without rescuing, to see him without absorbing his shadow. Because the moment you stop fighting for his presence, he will have no one left to project his fears onto. He will meet himself in the silence he created. And that, more than any conversation, is what begins to thaw the ice. There comes a moment in every woman's story when she realizes that his coldness was never truly about her. It was a mirror, reflecting how he wrestles with his own soul. His distance, his mood shifts, his sudden emotional absences, all of them reveal the internal war between the masculine urge to control and the unconscious longing to surrender. He stands at the crossroads of two archetypes, the stoic warrior and the wounded child. One seeks discipline and composure, the other aches for softness and home. When he retreats, you may begin to wonder, was any of it real? The way he looked at you when you laughed, the quiet reverence in his touch, the spark of something almost sacred between you. Did he just imagine it? No, it was real. But to a man who has learned to equate love with danger, reality itself becomes unbearable. When affection threatens to dismantle his carefully structured identity, he instinctively steps back. He must protect the illusion of control, even if it costs him intimacy. The ancient Stoics taught that freedom is mastery over one's inner state. But mastery without vulnerability becomes rigidity. Control without compassion becomes exile. The man who acts cold is often enslaved by his own stoicism. He clings to self-control not as wisdom, but as armor, unaware that his emotional restraint is just fear disguised as virtue. He believes detachment will keep him safe, but all it really does is keep him lonely. Inside every cold man lies a storm of contradictions. He wants to be known, but not judged. He craves closeness but fears dependence. He longs for love, but despises needing it. These paradoxes tear at him quietly, and instead of reaching out, he retreats into the familiar sanctuary of emotional isolation. There, he convinces himself he's in control again, though what he's really doing is negotiating with ghosts from his past. Jung believed that every relationship is a confrontation between two unconscious minds. When you trigger his withdrawal, you are not facing the man. You are facing the sum of all the feminine energy he once feared, misunderstood, or lost. Perhaps he once loved someone who betrayed his trust, or perhaps he learned early on that showing emotion would only lead to ridicule. Whatever the origin, the pattern repeats. Affection ignites anxiety. Intimacy awakens old wounds, and the cycle of avoidance begins again. But here lies the secret most women never see. His distance is not indifference, it's displacement. He is trying to push away the tenderness you evoke, not because he despises it, but because he doesn't yet know how to hold it without losing his sense of self. The more he feels, the more unstable his ego becomes. To him, love feels like a threat to identity. And so he seeks safety in detachment, mistaking numbness for peace. And yet, something always pulls him back. Perhaps it's the echo of your laughter that lingers in his mind when he's alone. Perhaps it's the way your presence reminded him of the person he once wanted to become before the world hardened him. He won't admit it, but he feels the gravitational pull of the feminine energy that once frightened him. In Jungian terms, your presence awakens his anima, the soul within him that longs to feel, to create, to surrender to life again. The more he resists, the more his shadow grows restless. You may notice it. The flashes of tenderness breaking through his distance, the accidental softness in his voice, the quick glance he can't quite hide. These are his unconscious betrayals, proof that the mask is cracking. His ego tells him to run, but his soul whispers, "Stay." He is both prisoner and guard, torn between the part of him that fears love and the part that knows it is the only thing that can save him. But remember this: the cold man cannot be thawed by your warmth alone. His healing begins not when you reach for him, but when you stop chasing the illusion of completion. Your stillness, your self-possession, your refusal to shrink in response to his absence. These are the lessons his soul is trying to learn. When you remain whole in the face of his retreat, you embody the feminine archetype that Jung called Sophia, wisdom itself, unattached yet profoundly compassionate. You are not meant to heal him by losing yourself. You are meant to embody the truth that he must find his own way through the labyrinth of his psyche. And when you do, something remarkable happens. The coldness that once froze you begins to lose its power. His withdrawal no longer defines your worth. You begin to see his behavior for what it truly is, not a reflection of your inadequacy, but a symptom of his fragmentation. That realization is freedom, because once you stop taking his distance personally, you return to your own center, where love is not a negotiation, but a vibration that flows naturally from self-awareness. You begin to understand that you were never meant to melt his ice. You were meant to illuminate it, and sometimes that light, calm, steady, unbothered, is the very thing that begins to awaken the warmth he thought he had lost forever. The coldness of a man in love is not a weapon. It is a shield forged in fear. To understand it is to step into the ancient psychology of the masculine, where affection has long been mistaken for weakness and emotion treated as betrayal. He does not act distant to punish you. He acts distant because something within him cannot yet reconcile love with safety. He grew up watching men survive by silence. He learned that composure was power, that control was strength, that the only acceptable emotion was anger, because anger still feels like authority. So when tenderness rises in him, it doesn't feel empowering. It feels dangerous. It threatens to dismantle the fragile scaffolding that holds his identity together. And so, rather than facing that inner collapse, he detaches. Carl Jung taught that the human soul is not built on reason, but on tension, the battle between opposites. The masculine energy seeks order, the feminine, expression. When love enters his life, these forces collide. He is drawn to your emotional intelligence, your ability to feel deeply, to flow without resistance. But that very fluidity exposes his rigidity. You embody everything he secretly lacks: emotional depth, vulnerability, softness, and that both mesmerizes and terrifies him. To him, love feels like a mirror that refuses to lie, and when he looks into it, he sees the parts of himself he's buried, the parts that ache to be free. You remind him of his own unlived life, the dreams he silenced to appear strong, the tenderness he abandoned to stay in control. The warmth he feels toward you is not just desire, it's nostalgia for a self he lost. That's why your presence unsettles him so profoundly, because it awakens the very humanity he spent years suppressing. When he acts cold, he's not rejecting you. He's rejecting the transformation that love demands. Jung would say he's resisting individuation, the process of becoming whole, and wholeness requires confrontation with the shadow, the repressed fears, wounds, and emotions he has never dared to face. Your love, whether you realize it or not, calls him into that confrontation. It stirs the child within him who was told to be brave, who was never allowed to cry, who mistook suppression for maturity. So he hides behind logic. He rationalizes, deflects, minimizes. All attempts to stay in the safety of the intellect where emotion cannot reach him. But intellect is a fragile fortress. Eventually it crumbles under the weight of what the heart demands, and when it does, he'll either face his truth or run from it completely. This is the moment that decides the fate of so many relationships, whether the man chooses courage or comfort, confrontation or avoidance. But the lesson is not his alone. It is yours, too. Because to love a man who acts cold is to learn the art of detachment without bitterness. It is to see his pain without drowning in it. It is to remain open without becoming a savior. You cannot heal what he refuses to feel, but you can become the embodiment of emotional truth, the grounded feminine energy that refuses to negotiate its worth for temporary affection. You must understand, when you chase the cold, you confirm his fear that love is something that consumes. But when you withdraw into your own warmth, you teach him something his soul has forgotten, that love can exist without control, that affection can be steady, silent, patient, that emotional maturity is not dependence but balance. In that quiet, something begins to shift inside him. He starts to notice the emptiness his detachment creates. The same silence that once gave him safety begins to echo. He realizes that his so-called strength has kept him alone. His composure, once his pride, now feels like exile. And for the first time, he begins to long not for excitement, but for peace, the kind of peace he felt only in your presence. But by then, you will have changed. You will have risen from the confusion of, "What did I do wrong?" into the clarity of, "I did nothing but love." You will have reclaimed your energy, your intuition, your serenity. You will understand that your worth does not depend on whether he awakens, because awakening is a personal choice, not a prize to be won. The truth is, a man's coldness cannot extinguish a woman who knows who she is. Her warmth is not a tool to melt him. It is a reflection of her sovereignty. She can love him and still walk away. She can see his wounds and still choose peace. She can witness his inner war and refuse to enlist. And paradoxically, it is that freedom, that calm, unapologetic wholeness that often awakens the very tenderness he buried. Because the masculine heart, for all its pride, recognizes truth when it stands before him. When a woman no longer seeks to heal him, she becomes the mirror through which he finally sees himself. In her silence, he hears what words could never teach him. That love was never supposed to be a battlefield. It was supposed to be a mirror. Eventually, his coldness becomes its own kind of mirror, not of rejection, but of revelation. The stillness that once wounded you now begins to teach you. You start to see that his silence, his distance, his detachment were never personal daggers aimed at your heart. They were signs of a deeper imbalance, the disconnection between the masculine and the emotional, the rational and the intuitive, the mind and the soul. He isn't cruel because he enjoys cruelty. He is frozen because he is afraid of thawing. The modern man lives in exile from his emotions, surrounded by noise yet starved of meaning. He has been conditioned to see love as a risk, vulnerability as weakness, and emotional depth as instability. So when he encounters a woman whose presence pulls truth from the shadows, it feels like standing before the divine. Beautiful, but blinding. Jung would say that the woman becomes the projection screen for the man's unintegrated anima, the embodiment of everything he has repressed. Through her, he meets his soul, but before he can embrace it, he must wrestle with it. And that wrestling often looks like withdrawal, arrogance, or even indifference. He cannot yet distinguish love from exposure. He fears that if he lets himself feel, the flood will destroy him. You, on the other hand, were never meant to be his floodgate. Your task was never to contain him, but to reflect him, to show him the truth without becoming the casualty of his fear. The moment you begin to confuse his emotional paralysis with your inadequacy, you lose the sacred balance between compassion and self-respect. For the woman anchored in her worth, his coldness ceases to be a riddle to solve. It becomes a symbol, a reminder that no amount of warmth can awaken a man who still worships his numbness. The transformation begins when you stop performing emotional rescue. You stop explaining, convincing, proving. You stop bending yourself into softer shapes just to earn his tenderness. You realize that love is not meant to be extracted. It is meant to be exchanged. If you have to beg for warmth, you are no longer in love. You are in servitude. And servitude is the death of the feminine soul. There's a moment of awakening that every woman meets in this journey. When she finally steps back and watches him retreat without panic. When she no longer interprets distance as danger. When she understands that a man's silence can coexist with her peace. That she can grieve what could have been while honoring what is. In that moment, something shifts. She no longer seeks closure from him, because she's already found it within herself. You see, every time you hold your center while he withdraws, you dismantle an old pattern, the ancestral conditioning that taught women to earn love through suffering. You become a new archetype, the conscious feminine, rooted in both strength and softness. You love deeply, but you do not chase. You empathize, but you do not absorb. You witness, but you do not fix. And as you rise into that energy, he begins to feel something unfamiliar. Not guilt, not pressure, but a quiet sense of loss. For the first time, he realizes that your presence was not something to control, but something to cherish. That your love was not a demand, but a mirror of grace. His coldness, once his defense, now becomes his own punishment. He stands in the emptiness he created and sees what he has lost. Not just you, but the version of himself that only existed in your warmth. This is the turning point for many men. Some remain frozen, unable to step into the vulnerability their soul craves. Others begin the long, silent work of integration, the journey Jung called individuation. They begin to reclaim the emotions they abandoned, to face the fears they projected, to soften the edges that once kept them safe. Slowly, they learn that love does not destroy the self. It refines it. But whether he awakens or not is no longer your responsibility. Because by now, you've learned that emotional maturity is not measured by how much pain you can endure in love, but by how much peace you can maintain in the face of uncertainty. You have become the embodiment of what Jung called the self-actualized feminine, the woman who no longer defines her value through the approval of the masculine, but through the radiance of her own consciousness. In the end, his coldness was the teacher you didn't know you needed. It forced you to turn inward, to find the warmth you kept seeking outside. It showed you that love without self-awareness becomes attachment, and attachment without boundaries becomes suffering. Now you see it clearly. You were never meant to melt for anyone who fears their own fire, because the woman who knows her worth doesn't chase, she chooses.